You mentioned Tiananmen Square also. You have a video on that as well. I mean, was it just about democracy, people wanting democracy, or was there also a reaction to like all of the reforms?
Yes, it was about democracy, but it wasn't what was really driving it. I mean, all the attention has been on the students, but actually it was so much more than that. And as I was talking earlier about the insecurities and the difficulties that people were facing throughout the 1980s as their lives got more and more unpredictable and in many cases harder, and they're seeing, government officials and party officials enriching themselves around them. In the West, it's portrayed as a socialist or communist leaders stamping out calls for liberal democracy when they sent the tanks in and violently ended it. Wang Hui says, actually, this was a capitalist state, essentially, shutting down calls for socialism. And the 1992 tour by Deng Xiaoping to reinvigorate the special and economic zones, call for more foreign investment and get the economy going again, for him, that is the moment where China really switches course and you start to see much more an acceleration of the privatization of state-owned enterprises, and a lot more sort of these capitalist transformations taking place through the 1990s. So a lot of people will say that Chinese socialism really ended in 1989 and moved onto a capitalist path, which is a very, very different understanding of the kind that you get, the sort of traditional liberal telling of it that you'll find tend to find in the UK and the US.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Dr. Jane Hayward, a lecturer in Chinese studies at the Lao China Institute at King's College. She has a YouTube channel where she makes videos explaining how China works and various misconceptions about China. And I found her channel from somebody who sent me a video that you made that was covering my Cultural Revolution video. And when I saw that, I was like, oh boy, oh no. Is this going to be a huge critique? And I was actually quite flattered that you very much liked the video. You seem to give it its props.
The title of the video is that it's a great video, isn't it? Isn't that in the title?
Yeah, but I thought you were going to say like, right? So,
sure. There had to be a small but, because I had to say something you hadn't said in order to get people to watch my video. So there was a small but it was only a very small one.
Right. You understand the YouTube thumbnail meta game already. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, basically you seem to think the video was very good. And you point out one of the things that I didn't talk about as much in the video, which was the international context surrounding the Chinese Cultural Revolution. And yeah, so I basically found your work there. I've listened to just about all your short little videos now. I would recommend you as a good resource. But the first question I want to get to before we cover like the broader topic of this podcast, which is kind of more generally how China works and some misconceptions that both people on the right and left have of China. first thing is, what made a scholar like you actually want to make YouTube videos? Because, I think a lot of scholars tend to have a very dismissive view of YouTube, and YouTube is frankly polluted by a lot of blind leading the blind, if I'm being honest. So what made
that's
you want
true.
to get into this space?
Yeah. What made me want to do it? Okay, so this basically it goes like this. I was making videos during the lockdown when I was lecturing. We had to start making recorded videos. So I started making videos for the students instead of lecturing in person, and they went down very well, and I quite enjoyed making them. And then I thought, and it was general frustration with not very limited and often misleading public discourse about China. I did, think, as a lot of academics do, that we should be doing more public engagement. And so I thought, I'll make a website and I'll put videos out on the website and then I'll share them on social media. And then I started doing that for a while, and, a few people were watching, but actually they were people in the China field already. So it was, people who already know about China watching my videos, and it was sort of almost a waste because, they know the stuff I'm talking about. They already know the debates that I'm discussing and stuff like that. But I thought, I'll store some of my videos on YouTube just as another place to watch them, and then maybe some other people will find them. And I didn't know at the time about the algorithm. I was completely clueless about technology and stuff. And then I realized that the algorithm occasionally would pick up one of the videos and shove it out to loads of people, and I would get loads of views. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. Let me pursue this and see how far it goes. So I started looking more and more into YouTube. One of the things that I did when I started training myself up in how to do YouTube, one of the things that they tell new YouTube creators is go online and see if there's an audience for what you want to do. Have a look and see if there are other videos out there, because if there's no audience, you're not going to get any views. It was in that process that I came across your Cultural Revolution video, which was very, very well researched and was getting loads and loads of views. And I thought, great. So that's really how I came across your video. It was doing research into, is my channel going to work? So that's the story. But really what drove it was the poor knowledge and the limited public discourse about China in this country and also in the US, I guess, which are the two countries I know best.
Yeah, you're fluent in Mandarin, right?
I'm rusty, but yes.
And you lived in China for a bit?
I lived in China. I've lived there on and off for something like 8 years. I was there as an English teacher when I was 18. Then I went back for almost 2 years to study the language. Then I was there for a couple of years as a PhD student. And then I was there for 3 years as a postdoctoral researcher in Beijing. And there have been various other shorter trips alongside that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's good that you're now on this platform, because I think there's a big lack of people who actually do research in this field. I mean, I wouldn't undertake a project like doing a video on the Cultural Revolution. It's pretty damn hard to, cover topics like that. I only did it because, as you know, I had already written something on it. And that was like, from there, I just turned it into a video script and kind of I went back to some work to look at like the details of the chronology of it all, because that's the difficult thing, is kind of explaining the chronology, like how getting it right in order, because it's such a complicated event and all the YouTube videos are like 4 minutes saying, well, the Cultural Revolution is just Mao telling all these people to magically rise up and kill all its rivals.
Absolutely. And in fact, to my shame, I have a 5-minute video, I think, on the Cultural Revolution. So your video was great.
I can assure yours is better than Vox's 5-minute video. But
really?
It seems to me like a lot of the misunderstanding in the West when it comes to China has led to a weird mirror of that reaction, which is like some people on the left who want to capitalize on the misconceptions. And it's like a weird Cold War thing where you have like a Cold War anti-China narrative. And at the same time, like some people on the left who want to think like China is the Soviet Union. trying to
That
counter
you mean they
US
want to
hegemony.
defend it? They think that it's the socialist future and it's going to lead all of us, or just the global south, but all good socialists will follow China into a beautiful socialist utopian future. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
Yeah, or
And
challenge US hegemony. Like I think it's like one different to defend China against propaganda versus defending it as like this sort of, not even the Soviet Union in general, like defending it like as if it was the early Soviet Union, which I find kind of amusing.
Yeah.
But I guess there's many misconceptions, because one thing is for sure, a capitalist communist, we can get into that, like what is China? But I mean, it has been a success story in many undeniable benchmarks,
hugely.
like, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, no one can say it hasn't. I mean, I suppose people try. People say they're an evil authoritarian regime. I mean, some people would say that's because they're beating us at our own game. They're doing capitalism better than we are. And people are very upset about that, I think. Will have difficulty getting their heads around it.
So I guess the first question there is the post-Mao period, because of course everyone knows something major happened, a major shift occurred during Deng Xiaoping with the reforms. But why didn't China end up like, let's say, Russia under Gorbachev, or Russia after Gorbachev when they did even more market reforms under Yeltsin? Why did China escape, as they call it, shock therapy? And how did like this kind of reform work for them? And I guess what were the reforms?
What were the reforms? So the reforms. So Deng Xiaoping comes in 1978 after Mao has died in 1976. He beats off a rival in 1978. He starts to launch what has become known as reform and opening. Is this what you're asking me about? And then how they managed to make that succeed for as long as they do without collapsing, which many people thought that they would.
Mm-hmm. Well, also like just the reforms when it comes to agriculture, farming, and also like the pricing system, special economic zones. They're kind of referring to all of that, which I know didn't occur at the same time, but it's all under Deng, right?
It's all under Deng Xiaoping, who was very much paramount leader for a very long time, and really until he died, until 97, although he wasn't like officially head of China all of that time, but he was very much in reality head of China. So he comes in 1978, the way that he comes in, he launches the reform and opening in 1978. And the first thing that he does, to huge controversy, is he begins to accept the dismantling of the people's communes. So agriculture at this point has been organized during the Mao period through the 50s and through the late 50s and the 60s, and most of the 70s was organized based on these massive communal farms, the people's communes, where people work the land collectively. They hand a lot of the produce over to the state. The state then uses what's been produced gives it to urban areas. So the whole economy is based on an urban-rural divide. And people have a passbook, which actually was based on the Soviet system. They have a passbook or a registration permit called the Hukou system. And if you live in a commune, you can't leave your commune and go and live in the city. You're known as a rural person. You're down officially as a rural person, and that means you have to stay in the countryside. You're registered to your commune, and sort of public goods are provided by your commune. They're provided locally, not by the state. So actually, in this situation, you are cut out of a lot of state support, because state support and public goods and social welfare are mostly being channeled into urban areas. And this is a way of the whole national system is a way of cheap grain from the countryside and using it as much as possible to feed people in the cities, to fuel industrialization, because they're focusing on industrializing as fast as possible. So you get although China is far more equal than many societies at this point, you actually it's built on extraction from the countryside and fundamental urban-rural inequality. Some people will tell you that's capitalism. Some people will tell you that's a form of primitive accumulation, essentially, and there's a fundamental class inequality here. And so it's really a capitalist system, but a state capitalist system rather than a kind of market capitalist system. So that's one big debate that's been going on for a long time. What Deng does, which is really your question, he comes in 1978, and the first thing that he does is start to dismantle the communes. Actually, there's an awful lot of people in the communes already who are wanting to dismantle it. The communes, there'd always been lots of arguments about the extent to which, even though these are collective and even though these are farming is collectively organized, can people also have their own little plot of land on the side? And if they can have their own little plot of land on the side, say per household, can they maybe, if they produce quite a lot because they're quite skilled farmers, can they sell a little bit and maybe make a little bit of wealth? So that's a conversation that's been going on from the 50s through the 60s. And Deng Xiaoping was one of the people back in the 60s who was quite supportive of this, having a little bit of markets going on the side of the communes. And so what happens when he really launches reform and opening in 1978 is that idea really starts to take off. So you start to get people, but it starts to take off so much that the people who are supporting it actually start to dismantle the communes themselves and say, stuff this, let's organize land on the basis of our households, let's not have communes at all. Now, a bunch of officials, some local officials think this is a great idea and they support it, and Deng Xiaoping eventually supports it. But there's huge arguments about this because a lot of people say you're losing socialism here. So what they wind up doing, what winds up emerging out of this is something called the household responsibility system, whereby households organize production. In other words, as a family household, you can run your own farm. But the land is still collectively owned. That means you can't sell the land. The land isn't marketized. You can't buy. If you're a really successful farmer, there's no way that you can buy up everyone else's land and make a massive farm. So you're not getting processes of proletarianization as you might get under a much more capitalist system. But you are starting to get markets. Although there is the social organization in the countryside is still very equal. So this starts to go really, really well, actually. I mean, there are, as I said, lots of people who think this is a terrible idea and say this is going to lead to capitalism. But it's actually, on the whole, incredibly popular because a lot of people are starting to make a lot more money, and you're starting to see a lot more people's incomes in the countryside going up, which, as you can imagine, people are very happy about. Then there's a massive set of major debates around the mid-80s. So we're at 1984 at this point. And like elite policymakers at the top are starting to discuss, okay, so the markets have been going really well. Shall we now incorporate this into our version of what we consider our economy to be? So they debate, shall we start to call our economy a socialist commodity economy? And this word commodity, there are huge fights about it, as you can imagine, but eventually it gets through. So what you now have is a socialist commodity economy, which says markets and profit making are okay. That's 1984. After that, there is a sort of switch in the focus of the reforms from the countryside to urban areas. The way that the urban areas, the cities have been organized is basically, again, on the basis of not communes, but work units. So big collective forms of production or schools or factories. They're called work units. Again, you have your Hukou. You're not a rural person. You're an urban person. And you've got a much better life because you've got state benefits, much better state benefits than you would have if you lived in the countryside. And you've got a job for life because you're registered to your work unit for life. You can't go out, you can't switch jobs terribly easily. You don't get a huge amount of choice in what you do. In fact, you probably get no choice in what you do. But you have lifetime social security, you have state-provided schooling, you have state-provided housing. Economically, there's not a lot that you need to worry about. You're probably not going to get very rich. In fact, you're not going to get very rich. But you have a stable life and a stable income. So what happens after 1984 is that these market reforms start to move to urban areas, and they start to do what was really kind of very shocking to a lot of people. They start to move people onto temporary contracts. And in some of these state-owned enterprises, they start to lay people off. Now, imagine that if you've lived for decades under a system that has provides your livelihood for life and you don't have to worry about it, suddenly people are being thrown onto the job market. And the job market is just emerging. It's a new thing. The whole concept of a job market is like something completely new that people are having to deal with. Okay, so that's one thing that's going on. There's the emergence of a job market. At the same time, there are discussions amongst the top economic planners. They know that they want to introduce, this is now a socialist commodity economy. They know that they want to start to introduce markets, but they want to do that very, very carefully. So they keep certain products, certain like basic things that, how can I put this? Things that that are absolutely essential. I'm forgetting the technical term, but basically like things. Sorry.
Stuff with inelastic demand, like that everyone needs, everyone will want anyway, which is easy to jack the price up if they, of course, allow it to be subject to market pricing.
Right. Let's go with that.
You're talking about the dual pricing mechanism, right?
Yes, exactly. So things are, exactly. Let's go. What was the word you used? Inelastic.
Well, yeah, because it means that like if a good is always in demand, its demand isn't going to shift. Whereas if it's like elastic demand, it's kind of something you don't need and it can shift. It's better for the market. Stuff that's inelastic.
Okay, great. Yeah, I like that. I've not heard that term before, but great. So I think the term I have in my head is consumptibles, but I'm not sure that's the right word. But things that people like are going to need on a daily basis. And you're right, it's not, they can buy this or this one or that one. So bowls, chopsticks, chairs, these are starting to be moved onto market prices. They're still quite controlled, but they're moved onto market prices. And things like steel and coal are absolutely controlled by the state. So there's no market in that whatsoever. But through this gradual introduction of market pricing for some products, number one, certain people, if you have a factory that makes bowls, you're starting to make more money. And that might if you're the factory manager, the factory owner, excuse me, I need to be very careful about when I say the word owner at this point. But eventually, of course, these factories are starting to be privatized. That's actually something more that kicks off in the 1980s. But you are starting to see private markets develop slowly at this point. And along with that, prices are going up. And this is happening. You're starting to see inflation as well because prices are going up. And this is really something that Chinese people have not had to deal with for a very long time. So you've got a lot of things happening. First of all, people are losing their job security. Prices are starting to go up. And the money that they have is losing its value because of inflation. So this is a massive shock to people. This is what eventually, the other thing, there's a huge amount of corruption going on. If you have political power because you're in a politically influential position, at this point, before there was hierarchy within the Communist Party, but there wasn't massive wealth inequality. There was hierarchy in terms of social and political status. But what's happening now is increasingly you're starting to see wealth inequality emerge. Now that's partly because of the markets, but if you're politically connected, in particular if you're involved with the planning system, you're in a position that you can buy stuff at planned prices and sell at market prices. make a huge amount of money. And politically connected people are starting to do this. So people are watching as their lives are getting harder and more turbulent and less secure, and their money is going down in value. They're starting to see well-connected people get richer and richer, and not because they're working hard, because they're ripping off the system. And this is what leads to, this is very much driving the anger behind what leads to the protests in Tiananmen Square. Let me come back to your original question. How did they avoid shock therapy? That was what we started with, wasn't it?
What I kind of am assuming in that question is not that there wasn't any shock therapy, but that they didn't have like USSR levels, like 90s USSR or post-USSR dissolution levels of inflation and all of that.
So I mentioned earlier the debates about the commodity. Do we accept this thing called the commodity as part of our... and there were, of course, part of that was the introduction of dual-track pricing. And do we officially move on to dual-track pricing, and do we accept the introduction of a market economy? So hang on, let me get my head into this a little bit. So there were huge debates about first of all, there are people who don't want... Oh no, hang on, that's completely wrong. So I'm getting this from Isabella Weber's book, mostly, which is excellent, called How China Escaped Shock Therapy. And she makes very... Do you know it?
Yeah.
Have you read it?
Yeah, it's the one I actually, I'm kind of doing research in preparation for a future video, but it's still very much in the process. That's one of them.
Yeah, great. I reviewed it for her, and it took me... It's incredibly hard to read, but it's totally... Well, for me it was, because I don't have quite the economic background that she has. But it's totally fascinating. And what she really goes into in a lot of depth is the extent to... she makes very clear. So these debates are so often presented as a bunch of backward communist ideologues who don't want change and don't want the market reforms, versus the good progressive reformers who want to bring China into, the future of the future modern world. And that's so often how it's presented in these very stark binary terms. But what she makes clear in her book is that actually that wasn't true at all. Everyone knows change needs to happen. Everyone is pro the reforms. The question is, how fast do we go? The question is, how cautious do we need to be? And what she makes clear is she traces through these debates, and they're going on throughout the 1980s, is that, let me try and remember this right. There are Deng Xiaoping, actually, that they're speaking to a bunch of they're speaking to lots of people. They're speaking to advisors, policy advisors and economists from various places in Europe, from America, from Latin America, and taking on all these ideas. And they're talking to a bunch of basically neoliberal people from the US and other places, arguing in favor of shock therapy, saying what you really need to do is absolutely liberalize your pricing system all at once. That's going to get your market going. At the same time, there are people saying, no, that's not a good idea. We should do this gradually. We should hold on to some planned prices and switch very, very slowly over to the market. What she makes clear, and this is really fascinating, is that so Deng Xiaoping in particular was actually quite pro shock therapy. And at certain times, so there are 2 times when they almost went with it. But there are enough policymakers saying, for God's sake, don't do that, it could be a disaster, that they swung away from it. In particular, she talks about an alliance between some very smart young economists who had experience of being in the countryside. I believe she said it was during the Cultural Revolution they spent time in the countryside. So or at least they've been doing research out in the countryside. I may have got that wrong. But they understood the situation in the countryside. They could see that the economy really was not very developed in the countryside. And they were like, if you free up the pricing mechanism, it's going to be a complete disaster. And they allied with some of the sort of stalwart communist veterans like Chen Yun, who was like, he's going to accept the market reforms, but you need to do this very, very carefully. He's often talked about as like the backwards dinosaur that tried to prevent reform. But Isabella Weber puts him in a completely different light. And she says, actually, if not for him and his alliance with these smart young economists, they would have gone with shock therapy and it would have been an utter disaster and they would have crashed the entire economy. And you may well have seen the kind of disaster that you got in the Soviet Union.
But
So twice that happened. Sorry?
I guess what this immediately shows, which will be surprising to some people, is that like China wasn't a dictatorship in the kind of one-man sense. It was a collective dictatorship. Like a party had a monopoly on political power, but it does not, no person in that party has a monopoly on power. We can maybe talk about later whether that's changing, but they, at this point, they had to like have, democracy within the party to an extent in which like you had to get approval from different party elites, not just like one guy with an iron rule.
We can talk about whether or not it's democracy. They certainly have open debates and they're certainly listening to each other and they're certainly arguing about what's the best thing to do. And that openness of discussion is fascinating and incredibly important and really underlies the success that they had during the 1980s. Yeah, basically. It does seem that, they were having huge problems. The inflation that they were having led up to, basically, as I mentioned, I think earlier, the problem, what happened in Tiananmen Square, the massive demonstrations there. But yes, they did avoid shock therapy, even though they almost went with it on 2 occasions. Does that answer your question?
Yes. And like this is a sort of follow-up question, which is that's the impression I also got from her, which is that like this story of it being only like the anti-revisionist people who wanted pure communism versus the people who wanted capitalism. It's like a false dichotomy.
Totally.
And what's interesting, though, is a lot of like neo-Maoists today kind of believe that story. They see it as like a coup of Deng, and that only him and his faction and the people who ended up winning after the Gang of Four was prosecuted and all that, that's like they were the capitalists and you had the people resisting it. But clearly something wasn't working. And I guess that is something I want to, you to elaborate on is what exactly about the collective farm situation wasn't working and why wasn't it working? Because what do we mean by working, right? Because I think that is maybe the bitter pill to swallow for some people who are more, I guess, Maoist sympathetic.
Yeah. I haven't studied the communes all that. So I'm not massively well read on the 1970s. So, but largely, to say that there wasn't growth isn't true. If you think about the amount of social and political turmoil that China went through and the extent to which they were in a horrendous situation, because certainly through the 60s, they had enemies on both sides. They felt and probably were very threatened by the Soviet Union and the United States. There were congressmen in the United States who were very, very hostile towards China and very pro the idea of going and bombing it. There was serious hostilities coming up to military skirmishes on the borders in 1969 with the Soviet Union. So, and another reason, actually, now that I think it all through, is that do you know about the Third Front?
What specifically?
You know what it is, because a lot of people have never heard of it.
No.
Okay, great. So it's massive. It's so important to understanding the Mao period, but so few people know about it because it's so little written about. Mao Zedong, this started in 1964. He knows that he's very afraid literally of the Soviet Union invading from one side, the United States invading from the other and carving China up. He literally thinks that may well happen. And in the circumstances, it probably wasn't the craziest thing to think.
Yeah, Vietnam War, especially after...
Right, exactly. Now, most of the leaders around him weren't buying that. But eventually, when the Vietnam War starts to heat up, they think, oh, okay, yeah, we need to do something to protect ourselves. So they come up with this idea. Mao's been wanting to do this for ages, but eventually the other leaders back him. They pour, and I don't have figures for you, but they pour astonishing amounts of funds into setting up a massive set of military and industrial bases in the countryside, in mountainous areas, in the sort of thinking central and western parts of China. And they put something like I said, I don't have the figures in front of me, but something like a half of their GDP, whatever, is going into this. It's astonishing. Like in crazy levels of funds. And they're sending people down there, and it's a terribly, terribly hard life because you're trying to build up military infrastructure in these horrendously remote, rocky areas. The idea behind this is if they attack us, our military infrastructure is going to be protected by the mountains, because he's worried that the cities are going to get bombed, that kind of thing. So there's a great book on this by Cavell Maskins called Mao's Third Front, which I totally recommend, and it's absolutely fascinating. When people say China didn't have good growth, in fact, they did have growth. There is clearly growth through the Mao period. The fact that they achieved that in the hostile conditions that they were in, when they weren't connected into international markets, partly because the rest, the capitalist world was very hostile to them. So it wasn't just for ideological reasons. But also they're putting massive amounts of funds into this military infrastructure. And it really was massive amounts of funds. It's not that surprising that there wasn't a huge amounts of growth and rising living standards. So in the
but
communes...
Of course, to validate your point about the growth, like as you recall in the Cultural Revolution video, I mentioned that China had, I think, higher growth than Indonesia and India at the same time, roughly, or at least very close levels of growth, which, it's like, despite all of that turmoil. So it was a disaster. But I guess the question is that, like, why was there such a kind of near consensus that something needed to be changed regarding, like the markets and the kind of collectives?
Why did they decide something needed to be changed? Because they could see how, I don't like the term backwards, but they could see how much they had not developed compared to other countries. They were well aware of it.
Like South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore?
Japan. Deng Xiaoping. Now this I think is probably an oversimplification, but Deng I think it was 1979, but once he's consolidated power, the first thing he does is go to Japan and America and realizes how far advanced they are compared to the situation China's in. Now, I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it was that causal. But I mean, they were well aware that they hadn't developed as much as other places. They're no longer, rapprochement with the United States has happened. Mm-hmm. That officially happened under Nixon in 1972. It's kind of consolidated by the end of the 70s when Deng Xiaoping comes in. Now, there's an interesting question. So the person that Deng Xiaoping had a massive rivalry with, Hua Guofeng, who had actually officially taken over the leadership after Mao, he's basically considered, a lot of people think that he was simply going to continue down the Maoist road. It's not at all clear that that's true. If you actually look at his policies, he may have actually done the same thing. But it wasn't just Deng Xiaoping, of course, who was thinking this. There was a general sense among the leadership that, we could be doing an awful lot better. If you then look at the speed with which the communes were dismantled and the enthusiasm with which people within the communes dismantled them and thought, phew, we can do better than this. They weren't popular. Life in the communes was really, really hard. This isn't some sort of socialist utopia where everybody's happy. They're hungry. I remember I was talking to colleague in China about what it was like. And I said, what was it like? And she said, hungry. We were always hungry. We were hungry all the time. That's not a nice life.
Right. And Deng Xiaoping kind of brings in the perspective with other people who share a more view that like you need wealth before you can like have a sort of distribution. Like you can't really do socialism without developing the productive forces.
Absolutely.
Or it's not did he say socialism is not a poverty cult? I think he also said something.
Oh, I don't know. I've not heard that one.
Right. But the one that he's most famous for is I don't care what color the cat is as long as it catches mice.
Right. And he said that in 1962. So that was when they were talking about the, when I mentioned earlier, when I mentioned earlier the little plots on the side of the communes for people to have themselves and a little bit of markets going on in the countryside. It was that context in which he said that.
Right. Because this is an old idea, even in the Soviet Union, like with Nikolai Bukharin, of course, proposes these kind of light market reforms with still like collective ownership and, the proletarian state in charge, but like with market reforms as a kind of alternative to Stalin's more harsh collectivization policy. And didn't Deng Xiaoping claim to be inspired by Bukharin? I recall reading that as well.
I don't know. From what you've said, he may well have been.
In any case, the thing you're saying is that like this wasn't just, a bunch of fuddy-duddy hardliners versus people who wanted the opposite, but like kind of most people believe something needed to change. It was a question of how much and when.
How much, and how fast. I mean, there were concerns that if you introduce markets, eventually you will get class difference. You'll wind up with a capitalist class, and the capitalist class will take over. I think that's entirely legitimate, and many people will tell you that is in fact what's happened. So,
sure. We'll get into that.
Yeah, sure.
You mentioned a few things earlier which are really relevant to this period, which is the Hukou system.
The Hukou system, yeah.
Hukou system, yeah. Hukou system. And they called like self-exploitation. And I find this very interesting because like, why did China grow so fast relative to like other countries that tried to marketize in the post-Soviet period, like Eastern Europe and the Soviet and Russia itself? Why did China do so well? And you're kind of seem to indicate in your video on that the Hukou system is like part of it has to do with the rural migrants and the fact that they had such a pool of cheap labor. So they were able to like be more, especially exploit their own labor force more, which made investment way more people wanted to invest in China. So you had tons of investment in China. And I find this interesting because some people say like whether China is still Marxist, right? And I mean, if you do read Capital, you can take like an opposite conclusion, like, exploitation's bad, but it's also what creates wealth. You want to create a lot of wealth.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You just exploit labor force. I mean, you could say it is Marxist, but just not in a immediate socialist sense, like in the sense of building socialism right away.
Yeah. So your question is how come they grew so fast? I mean, how are they able to exploit the labor force to the extent that they did?
And the pros and cons with that, right? Because of course there's pros and cons with that, which I kind of want you to outline as you have done before.
Sure. So one of the reforms, I was talking about the reform period. So this is again going back to the early 80s. One of the things that they do is part of the philosophy of we're going to do this slowly is that they start to, rather than sort of marketize the economy everywhere all at once, they set up, so they've got the reforms, that the household responsibility going on in the countryside. And first of all, in the urban areas, is they set up certain zones, which they call special economic zones, where they start to introduce certain investment mechanisms for foreign investment to come in. And they start to be very experimental with various managerial practices. And they invite people in, or they invite people in to start setting up factories there. Some of these special economic zones, incidentally, they're on the east and the south coast, they tend to be. So Guangdong, there's one in Guangdong, eventually one in Shanghai as well. So Guangdong is just over from Hong Kong. Hong Kong at the time just so happened to have a labor shortage. So this is great for Hong Kong and it's great for China. What they start to do is a lot of investment. They encourage a lot of foreign investments. So this coming from America, a lot of it is also coming over, international investment coming in via Hong Kong. And they start to, so I've already said that people can't just move from the countryside to the cities because they've got their hukou. And their benefits, their welfare, their access to healthcare and things like that. If you're in a rural area, it's provided, originally it was provided by the commune. Now it's provided by, after the communes are dismantled, it's still provided by the local area. So it's provided by the village, but it's still attached to your local area, which means you don't have access to things like healthcare and education if you up and get a job in the city. So that system is still in place. But like the officials in the special economic zones, technically, if rural migrants are coming in from outside, they're there illegally, but they can see perfectly well that this is a massive opportunity to bring in low-cost labor. So they encourage rural migrants to come in from the countryside because they're not all required. Their labor isn't all required for the communes now that the countryside agriculture has been reorganized based on the household responsibility system. So people are now flooding into the cities because they can get a job in a factory and make a little bit more money. The hukou is really important here because once they're in the cities, the company they work for or the city that they're in doesn't have to provide them with permanent housing or healthcare or various kinds of social benefits or medical care. Because if that migrant gets sick, they have to go back to where they came from. So what you get is a situation of what you'd call social reproduction, where your basic requirements for living are still stuck in the countryside. So the city doesn't have to provide them for you, but you go to the city, you work temporarily, you're only ever on a temporary contract, and then once your labor is done, you go back again. And that system of where rural migrant workers were getting their sort of basic needs still back in the countryside actually winds up saving the cities and the urban companies and therefore the international investors' money. This is a point that Lin Chun has made very clearly. That's one reason, presumably, why rural labor in China was so cheap. Do you see what I mean? Because it's being subsidized still by the countryside. The countryside is subsidizing rural labor for international investors. So American companies coming in and investing in China are doing actually really well because the rural countryside is subsidizing them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just the connection is nobody really thinks about the Chinese countryside as helping out, American companies, but that's in fact what is happening here. It's also very, very connected. So you have a massive.
Pay less.
Sorry,
it allows them to pay lower wages because they're subsidized by the local.
They pay lower wages. They're only ever on informal contracts and sometimes no contracts because they're there illegally. They can't bargain or organize for better conditions because the second they do that, they're kicked out because they're there illegally. They have very little rights. They're open to all kinds of exploitation, and they can't push back because they're there illegally. So in all manner of ways, this works itself out in all manner of ways. So this starts to happen in the 1980s, particularly in the late 80s. In the 90s, it starts to kick off. Deng Xiaoping. So 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre happens. There's then a sort of America and other capitalist countries want nothing to do with China. It's very persona non grata for a few years. Then Deng Xiaoping in 1992, famously does a southern tour of the special economic zones, goes down to the south. He visits these factories and he says, he comes up with some phrase like, I can't remember if it's to get rich is glorious or something like that. I think he'd said that previously.
That's the old quote that Mao accused him of in the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's a term that comes up, I believe it several times during the
Well, it's
reform
actually
period.
paraphrasing Bukharin, because Bukharin told
Is it?
Yeah, because Bukharin said to the peasants in a very different kind of like context, enrich yourselves, because he wanted grain production, right? So like he was like, okay, this is an incentive, let's do it. But I guess this is a kind of different context for more like capitalism, like industrial capitalism. Yeah, you mentioned Tiananmen Square. Also, I do want to. You have a video on that as well. I mean, was it just about democracy, people wanting democracy, or was there also a reaction to like all of the kind of capitalist reforms?
It's very often portrayed in the press, in the British and American press, as being about democracy. And when we say democracy, the assumption is it's liberal democracy. The assumption is they want to be like us. One of the sort of really striking images of the demonstrations was of a sculpture put up by some art students in the square of the Statue of Liberty. And this was a lot of attention was paid to this in the outside coverage at the time. And the story, as it was told, was very much these poor students, they want to be like us, and the oppressive state is not letting them. But there's a lot been written about it since, including an article by Wang Hui that I think came out in 2004, who gives a completely different take on this and says the image that the West portrayed about this was misleading. So yes, it was about democracy, but it wasn't what was really driving it. I mean, all the attention has been on the students, but actually it was so much more than that. And as I was talking earlier about the insecurities and the difficulties that people were facing throughout the 1980s as their lives got more and more unpredictable, and in many cases harder, and they're seeing, government officials and party officials enriching themselves around them. This is why, Wang Hui says, this is largely what was driving the protest, and this is why the protest became so widespread and had so much public support. And there were many thousands of people involved, many people coming from different areas of life. I mean, it was the social mix was extraordinary. You had journalists, teachers, professionals, and factory workers, manual workers, all coming from different, slightly different life experiences. So democracy was very much what people were asking for, but how you understand that, and this is Wang Hui's point. His point is that sure, there were some people who would like liberal democracy the way that there would be in the West, but actually primarily that's not what was going on, and to portray it that way doesn't represent what this was about. Democracy for a lot of people meant greater social protections, meant don't leave us vulnerable to the ravages of the market like this. And that includes stuff like anti-corruption, which it was certainly about as well. But it was a socialist movement primarily, and certainly in important ways. I'm trying not to make it sound like it was one thing, because it was hugely complex. But he understands this as a socialist movement, essentially, or certainly very much being driven by that. And where people see in the West, it's portrayed as a socialist or communist leaders stamping out calls for liberal democracy when they sent the tanks in and violently ended it. Wang Hui says actually this was a capitalist state, essentially, shutting down calls for socialism. And the 1992 tour by Deng Xiaoping to reinvigorate the special economic zones, call for more foreign investment and get the economy going again, for him, that is the moment where China really switches course and starts to really move towards something which looks a lot more like neoliberalism in a sort of a Western sense. And you start to see much more an acceleration of the privatization of state-owned enterprises, and a lot more sort of these capitalist transformations taking place through the 1990s. So a lot of people will say that Chinese socialism really ended in 1989 and moved onto a capitalist path, which is a very, very different understanding of the kind that you get, the sort of traditional liberal telling of it that you'll find tend to find in the UK and the US.
Well, neoliberal, right? Some people would dispute that due to a lot of the way they handle capitalism. But I think what you're alluding to is like the cuts on welfare. Because didn't Deng Xiaoping end the Iron Rice Bowl program and led to kind of like two-tiered healthcare system, two-tiered education system, I believe, too. I do want you to get into like the state of welfare in China after those reforms, and also to what extent, like whether that's still the case today, because I've heard scholars say that like Canada has a bigger welfare state than China, like a more generous welfare state than China, and which leads to the question is China more capitalist than Canada and the US are, despite being like socialist in the sense of like a state that will discipline the capitalists? Because it's like kind of confusing.
So you're talking about, right, so the Iron Rice Bowl, what was that system of cradle to grave employment and public access to public facilities and access to healthcare, that is already starting to break down in the 1980s when you're starting to move people. But once you lose your work, once you're separated from your work unit in the cities, then you're already losing your Iron Rice Bowl because it's attached to your place of work. That is increasingly accelerated in the 1990s because there's an increasing push to reform state-owned enterprises throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And you get huge amounts of privatization and, again, a lot of asset stripping by well-connected state-owned enterprise managers wind up the owners. And there's some great, fascinating stuff written on that in terms of how sort of laws and regulations are interpreted in very slippery ways so that, you know, state managers wind up being the owners of these and the workers just get nothing. So social welfare, I can't give you a huge amount of information on it because I haven't massively researched details on it. But absolutely, it's poor. It's not good. So, yeah, you don't have a lot of it. Once you're moved on to a temporary contract or you don't have a job, life is very tough. Yeah, sorry, I don't know a huge amount about the specifics of it.
Well, I mean, it's the general idea that like part of their paradoxical success is that they could get so much investment, partially because of how exploited the workforce was, which itself says something. But, you know, there is something to be said as to like, why didn't China end up like Chile? Because, right, Pinochet had these reforms on Chile where, you know, like they dismantled the welfare state, they dismantled unions to lower wages, and you got all this investment coming. But when they had an economic crash, all that investment left, and Chile had a relatively stagnant growth ever since. So, I mean, why has China's growth been so much more explosive? Clearly, that must have something to do with like their capital controls and like the way in which the state kind of merges state planning with private investment and is able to kind of direct it. That's kind of the next thing I want to get into is like China's sort of capital controls and its controls over its billionaire class, because that's a narrative I hear a lot, which is true, but you've also made videos kind of problematizing this a little bit. which is the idea that China, quote unquote, disciplines its capitalist class. Its capitalist class is like subservient to the party state, which
Right.
I mean, it does seem to be true, like relative to like other capitalist countries for sure, right? So, we're looking at Elon Musk right now, like maybe if only like he could be disciplined by the state in the way.
I know, it's horrendous. Yes, it's extraordinary what's going on in the United States at the moment. So, okay, so are we jumping forward to now?
No, I kind of want to go from before and like how
Okay.
they avoided the Chile kind of situation where you get like lots of investment that just kind of leaves after. Like how were they able to sustain growth versus till now, Because
Okay,
it's like, yeah.
So a lot of the growth is being driven by the absolutely massive migrant workforce, which have some benefits, recall, but they are in the countryside, and they're very limited. So, okay, sorry, your question is, I'm trying to get my brain is slightly got confused.
It's all good. I can edit around, but yeah, no. To rephrase my question is that it's easy for a neoliberal economist perhaps to look at China and to say, well, they had a lot of foreign direct investment, and what you just need to do is dismantle your labor force and get that foreign direct investment, and you'll grow like China, which is a kind of neoliberal sort of interpretation of the event. But clearly that isn't really fully true, because other countries have done that approach and did not experience the same level of sustainable success. And that's why I mentioned Chile, because of course they dismantled welfare state, had suppression of unions and lower wages, but like the investment they got wasn't nearly as much. And also it left like when there was like slightest like economic crash. And because like when you have the option for capital flight, it can also, when you have like no capital controls, there's capital flight that can happen. And also like you can't, if the state isn't planning investment can kind of like won't always go in the places where the economy needs it the most. Right. And so I think like,
okay. So when you're saying that they're channeling investments, sure, they're channeling investment into the special economic zones, but I mean, there's huge demands from places, America in particular, and other places for this workforce. They've set it up in particular places, and it doesn't stop really. So I'm not quite sure what it is you're asking me about.
Okay, well, I guess more generally what I'll ask is what role does state planning still have in the introduction of this market system? And the follow-up question, which is related to this, is to what extent does do the Chinese Communist Party discipline their capitalist class? Because that's what everyone seems to, at least on the left, like about China. They point to that,
Yeah.
And they're like, why don't we do that to Elon Musk?
So they certainly set up incentives for where investment goes. I don't particularly think of China as a planned economy in a major way, but they certainly set up incentive structures for how to channel investment, and they certainly have major state-owned enterprises. So one of the things that they did during the 1990s, I was talking about the restructuring of the state-owned enterprises, which really takes off at this point. And a lot of the state-owned enterprises are privatized. And the smaller ones, many of them go bankrupt. And the larger ones, there's a few larger ones that the state really gets behind. And the basic goal is we're going to make these as big and powerful as we possibly can. And the goal is to turn these sets of state-owned enterprises into national champions. At the moment, China's the amount of state-owned enterprises in the economy is actually relatively small. It's mostly a private. Most enterprises are private enterprises, but they have a few incredibly powerful state-owned enterprises that they've channeled a lot of state investment and energy into. Oh, and the other part of your question was how the extent to which they discipline capitalists within their own country. Okay. So, yes, you're right. A lot of people on the left will look at the fact that they have gone after major sort of private entrepreneurs like Jack Ma, who was really in about, was it 2020? Really fell out of favor with the Communist Party and really lost his position and scurried off to Japan for a while. And there was huge publicity behind that because he was such a huge, high-profile entrepreneurial figure before that happened. There have been, again, around sort of 2020, 21, as part of that, and actually following what happens to Jack Ma, there have been a lot of attempts to rein in the power and wealth of certain individual entrepreneurs, and they've gone after certain industries. So the fintech industry, certain social media industries. Very, very sort of famously, they also went after the private tuition industry because middle-class families trying to get their kids into the best universities are constantly pressured to compete with other elite or wealthy or middle-class families who want the best for their children in a very, very competitive society. And it's a huge amount of expenditure. Basically, if everybody is getting private tuition for their kids, you have to do it too. And families end up spending huge amounts of money on this. So they also went after private tuition companies and said, you need to stop. You need to stop doing this to take the pressure off everybody. Now, this is talked about at the time as being socialist. I'm skeptical of the extent to which all of this was socialist and really about bringing in inequality. Sorry, really about promoting equality. Because there's nothing, and I'm still skeptical about this, there is nothing sort of necessarily uncapitalist about reining in certain particularly wealthy individuals. And if you look at the way the economy works, it's based on commodity production and profit making to such an extraordinary extent that it's very hard to, and a very oppressed labor force. There's no independent unions. There are unions, but the unions, there's an official state union, which tends to side with the workplace bosses over and over again, and they may take on a mediating role. There were certain periods where worker movements have been successful, and there have been times when the state has allowed certain forms of worker activism and been slightly more lenient to it. There were some very successful strikes after 2010, for example, when a lot of labor scholars were looking at China and thinking, finally, the working class movement is going to be allowed to take off at this point. But again, there were subsequent crackdowns on labor movements just a few years later, and under Xi Jinping, we've seen that continue. And there's really, really very little labor activism allowed. There are strikes. Strikes are technically illegal, but you do see a lot of wildcat strikes, but it's very difficult for them to get very much purchase and very much success. So it's very hard to see how this really is, for me, it's very hard to see how this is a socialist country of any real description. You also have, so go back again to the fact that I was mentioning the privatization of the state-owned enterprises. That led to a lot of very wealthy people with close connections to the party. So there were lots of debates around the end of the 1990s about how the party should really deal with this. And what happened in 2003 under Jiang Zemin was that they adjusted the constitution to allow capitalist entrepreneurs into the party. And as the scholar Lin Chun puts it, at that point, they had really given up any pretense that they were socialist whatsoever. You then have actually very wealthy people inside the party. Mm-hmm. Now, you can say that they've gone after a few wealthy entrepreneurs, but actually, it's a really serious question. Who is the party actually representing? And a lot of people will say the party itself is really capitalist when you get right down to it. There have been some like really fascinating exposés of the amount of wealth that some leading party officials, that the families of leading party officials have managed to accumulate. And the National People's Congress is one of the very high the National Congress is one of the very high political bodies in the party. And 2023, I believe it had 80 billionaires in it. So the wealth, it's not the case that you don't have Elon Musk in the White House. You certainly don't have that. But who the party represents, which particular class they represent, it's not workers by any stretch of the imagination.
Right.
Now, I know that people do make the argument you have to grow the productive forces and then you can redistribute wealth. I get that. But you know, it looks like rather an unrealistic prospect when you have so many wealthy people benefiting from the current system. Where is the sort of the catalyst for change going to come from that is suddenly going to spread this wealth across the land? Now, I know that there are small changes taking place. So there are small measures coming in, like cracking down on people's bonuses, to some extent capping people's salaries. But this is not major wealth distribution. We're really, I don't think, seeing that. Some people are looking at these changes and going, you know, these are signs of hope. But I'm very skeptical myself.
Well, one thing I was reading in a biography of Jiang Zemin, it was called "The Man Who Changed China," and apparently the rationalization for letting capitalists into the party was that they would fly to the West if they got too rich, and that they essentially like couldn't be contained. So the idea was keep your enemy closer by actually like having them have some level of political power, or else what they would do is they would kind of either leave, or they would go to collaborate with the West to kind of try to undermine the power of the party, and the party, in an attempt to maintain power, kind of like absorb them, which is interesting, but they still call themselves socialist. Jiang Zemin, of course, called it the social market economy. Then you have like
Oh yes,
the harmonious society.
They changed it to the socialist market economy. It went from socialist commodity economy to socialist market economy. That's right, during the reform period, and they still call it the socialist market economy. That's right.
Right, yeah. And so what they say is like they don't. Of course, I'm explaining more for the audience here. Is of course, Chinese Communist Party, but everyone knows it's like either at the very least a mixed economy, a capitalist economy, whatever you want to call it. It's definitely not communist. But like the goal that is the stated goal of the Chinese Communist Party is that they're moving towards communism, and they seem to continually shift that date. I believe it was 2050 and I think it got shifted again to 2070. I don't recall the exact date, but it seems to be far. But like that is what they say, right? That like once we're rich enough,
they call it the primary stage of socialism.
Yes.
My understanding,
which socialism seen as this is defined for them as like this transitionary period between like communism.
Right. Yeah. Right. So they've called it for a long time the primary stage of socialism. So there have been discussions about when that's going to end. There have been discussions about it. I believe that it has been suggested that they move soon to something like the intermediate stage of socialism. I believe it's been, I'm trying to remember the stuff that I read about this. I think that might be 2050. That might be what you were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
And then some high profile policymakers suggested, no, we can actually do that in 2035. Now, calling it the primary stage of socialism is, of course, to dangle something in front of somebody and keep moving it further and further away. I mean, I think there are plenty of people in China are well aware of that fact.
And something you pointed out in one of your videos is the kind of glaring omission of class in the language of the Chinese Communist Party, because I think some leftists observing this from halfway across the world will look at the kind of rituals of the Chinese Communist Party, because their official ideology is still Marxism, Leninism, and they often even speak in the language of like old Marxist-Leninist parties by talking about dialectical materialism. They'll even cite Marx to justify things they're doing, and they'll of course have big hammer and sickle, but like they seem to omit class. That's what you were talking about in the discussion. And I read Xi Jinping's manifesto, The Governance of China, and he doesn't seem to mention class once in it. He talks about common prosperity, but not class at all.
Right. So this is around the time of the debates on the commodity economy. Around 1984, the word class, Chinese word for class, basically vanishes. I was reading a couple of, when I was writing my PhD thesis, I was looking through collective works of two very well-known economists, and I was interested in how they talk about class during this period. And you can see it in the first part of the book. It's like chapters by them chronologically. And the first part of the book, it keeps coming up. And then at some point it stops. And it's an incredibly stark moment that there's a certain date after which you can't find the word class. And I was really stunned by this, and then went and found an article of somebody, a couple of scholars, Pun Gai and Chris King-Chi Chan, who have written about this and observed it and sort of pointed out that this has happened around that time, and that the word that came in to replace it is social strata. What social strata does is it talks about sort of gradations of wealth, rather than, it doesn't have the same structural meaning that class has. In other words, if you're a certain class, you're in an antagonistic, basically if you're a working class, you have an antagonistic relationship to the capitalist class, and it's not clear that you can, of course, you can shift between them. You can work for a factory and wind up being a factory owner. But there is a structural leap there that is not, most people will, for structural reasons, never be able to make. Social strata implies that if you work hard enough, you can climb up and be one of the rich people. So the structural analysis of how the economy and society works is entirely missing. And what Pun Gai and Chris King-Chi Chan point out is that this happens just around when they introduce the commodity, when they turn to the commodity economy, right? So at this point, you're starting to move towards the market, and it lays the groundwork for the massive migrant labor workforce, which is really a massive proletariat. Now, they still have land rights back in the countryside because they've still got their collective land rights, and as we talked about, they can go back to the countryside. So they're not going to fall into absolute destitution. But in terms of the labor that they are providing, and the amount of wealth that is producing for other people, they are a highly exploited class. And yet the word class is no longer there. So what Pun and Chan argue is that this is a strategic, deliberate move by the state to disempower this group of people so that they can't, people have come out of what used to be the Mao period where it was all about class struggle. This has now gone, so they can't identify themselves as a class, and they can't, or it becomes much more difficult for them to do that, and it becomes much more difficult for them to mobilize around their class identity. Instead, the ideology and the way of talking becomes about hard work, and becomes a new word comes in, which is suzhi, which means quality. And you can have, if you have a high suzhi, if you have high quality, you're a civilized person. And that means that it's very often tied to education, and it's very often tied to being urban. And one of the things that rural migrants will say is they want to go and get a job in the cities. It's better because if you're in a city, you have more suzhi, you're of higher quality. Whereas the quote unquote backward peasants are always going to be of low suzhi, of low quality.
Sounds like America and China have a lot more in common than they like to admit.
This is why, so the people that talk about China as neoliberal, and we can absolutely have a conversation about whether or not that's applicable, but this is the kind of thing that they're talking about. They would say this is an explicitly neoliberal move and a neoliberal discourse.
What made sense to me more than the neoliberal label is actually kind of what Henry Kissinger already said about China way back when he met with Mao and Lin Biao. Was it Lin Biao?
Lin Biao?
Not Lin Biao. How could I forget? The premier, Zhou Enlai.
Yeah, I'm forgetting his name as well.
Zhou
Enlai, yeah.
And when he said, he was asked, like, he wrote about this in his book, in the reflection on China, where he said, like, are they capitalists, communists, whatever? And he said, they're Chinese, which is like, they draw on a mixture of ideologies in China, like, there's Confucian aspects, there's Marxist aspects, but there's also like they just want to do what's best for what they think is best for.
They're pragmatic. The word pragmatic gets used an awful lot. Yeah. Now,
I think some people on the left, particularly the kind of neo-Marxist-Leninists, which are, I always tell people, like, some people think this is an online phenomenon. They're the fastest growing faction of communists, and I think it's partially because they feel a sense in which there's a winning team already, and that they can point to say, look, socialism works. Look at China.
Oh, okay.
And it's a real thing. And I think the reason why this narrative has seemed believable at all is because of the revival of ideology in China. It really does seem that, like, especially
when you say revival of ideology, what do you mean?
So what I mean, this is what I was about to say, in that the 2000s, it kind of seemed that, like, China was entering a almost post-ideological phase, in the sense that, like, instead of, already this was the case kind of starting with Deng, but like the leaders in China, like Jiang Zemin, would wear like suits, like kind of ordinary politicians, not these old military uniforms. Whereas you see and Hu Jintao also, right? Well, with Xi Jinping, one of the big changes that seems to have taken place is a revival of like ideological iconography. And reading the former Labour Party guy of Australia who wrote that book, China's Xi Jinping's Marxist nationalism. I'm forgetting his name, Paul, but no, Kevin Rudd. That's it.
Oh, okay, yeah,
Kevin Rudd.
Right, yeah.
I almost called him Paul Rudd, and that's the actor, Hollywood actor. No, but Kevin Rudd, yeah, he was describing like Xi Jinping takes ideology very seriously for the legitimacy of the party and avoiding what happened to the Soviet Union. So you seem to see, like, now Xi Jinping, of course, he wears like these military uniforms, kind of like Mao, and they do these parades. He speaks much more in like Marxist-Leninist language, and there seems to have been a revival of this, and also a kind of weird propaganda feat where I now see a lot of like Westerners who live in China making like content about like socialism and with Chinese characteristics. So it does seem like there's a very concerted attempt for a revival of ideology. Now, meanwhile, also a revival or a huge influx of surveillance. That's I'm guessing isn't very good for the labor movements there. But like,
no, it's not good for quite a lot of people, including the labor movement.
Right. What role does ideology play, Marxist-Leninist ideology play in China still to this day? Is it just a legitimating ideology for the party, or like, why do they still claim to be Marxist-Leninist? Because people want to point, who are Marxist-Leninist or sympathizers, want to point to that and say they're successful because of the Marxist-Leninist ideology, not because of these pragmatic reforms.
So Xi Jinping very much sees himself as someone who is going to bring China take it from the relatively successful place that it had gone to major powerhouse. And one of the ways that he's trying to do this is enforce discipline through the party. And ideology and discourse is part of that. So it's partly his personal leadership style. I don't like to get too obsessed with particular individuals. That's not how I try to think about things, but this is certainly something that is going on, and it's really important. So part of that is ideological training. There's always been ideology within China. There's always been official discourses, but there are particular moves by Xi Jinping to be very strict about the kinds of ideologies that are being used. So he's done a number of things. First of all, you're right that he's using Marxist ideology, and he's using, to some extent, Maoist imagery. I don't think he's a Maoist at all, but some people see the Maoist imagery that he's using and think he's like Mao. He's not. But he's certainly using it as a way to politically mobilize people and to portray the Communist Party as continuing its historic mission, in a sense. So that's why he's using it. At the same time, he has mixed it with Confucianism. So you get a lot of Confucian language and ideas mixed in with it as well. So it's not just Maoist ideas and imagery. It's also imagery about China's long history, imagery about China's supposed 5,000-year history. It's of course not that simple. It hasn't had an unchanging 5,000-year history, but this is kind of the narrative that gets talked about. And patriarchy and the importance of the Confucian Chinese family is a major part of this as well. One thing that has been happening, one of the ways that this plays out is that there is a demographic problem. There is an aging problem in China, as there is in many countries. There have been major public campaigns over the past decade, I guess, to try to encourage urban educated women in particular to have more children. So the one-child policy had been in place for a long time. In fact, it wasn't imposed everywhere, but it did have a major impact on the birth rate. So now there is a drive to try to get women to have more children, but in particular, it's urban educated women. This is who they want producing the young Chinese citizens of the future. Now, urban educated women are starting to get increasingly ideas about feminism and maybe not getting married and maybe not having children. And you're seeing this increasingly. And there have been stories in the press recently about the marriage rate really dropping, women just saying they don't want to get married. This was relatively unusual 20 years ago, but it's happening more and more. And that's a huge problem if you're China's leaders and you want to, and you have an interest in this particular group of women getting married and having children. Now, Confucianism is part of that. Confucianism, obedience to the family, patriarchy within society generally. So later, Hong Fencher is somebody who writes a lot about this, and her point is that authoritarian leaders, as one of the ways to bolster their legitimacy, is to appeal to men, to make men in society feel empowered, because they're not getting their legitimacy isn't based on the vote, obviously. So, and in particular, as you may start to see an economic slowdown and people's job prospects and future prospects weren't perhaps what they used to be, masculinity is one of the things that you can appeal to try to get people on side. And so you empower people through their sense of masculinity rather than, I guess, economically. So this is one thing that's going on. Number one, appealing to men through a sense of patriarchy, and at the same time trying to encourage women that their job is to, urban educated women in particular, that their job is to marry the man and have baby. It's not going well. But this is part of what the turn to Confucianism is about. Part of it.
That was my hunch about Marxism-Leninism being a legitimating ideology. So it's interesting about Confucianism also being a legitimating ideology, because of course you need men to fight in the wars. That's a big part of it.
Yeah.
And women, right? Or who's probably more likely. And the aspect of Marxism-Leninism being a kind of ideology that gives the party a reason to exist. Because if its legitimacy isn't based on being voted to power in a competitive election, what is it based on? Well, performance. And if it doesn't perform due to some factors that might be out of its control, what keeps it in power, this like idea that you're going to move towards this future goal. Now, I do wonder though, to what extent does like the party leaders actually maybe believe this? Because it's hard to tell, because when you look at the actual rituals, it really does seem as though they do believe they are moving to kind of socialism, albeit one very far removed from Marx or Lenin's original conception. But still, like, they seem to believe in like a certain kind of like socialism, some kind of grand mission. Or is this like just purely a kind of way to latch on to power, or do they actually believe it? I guess that's
I've no reason to think that Xi Jinping doesn't absolutely believe it. I mean, I can't get inside anybody's head. My hunch is Xi Jinping absolutely believes it, and that you know, he's got a mission, and this is how he's going to accomplish it. That's my sense. I mean, I don't know, but that's my sense. An awful lot of people in China don't think China's really socialist. So the other leaders, other people in positions of power, I don't know. An awful lot of people join the Communist Party because it has good job prospects attached with it. An awful lot.
What I do find very suspect is that, like, so there's this argument some people who want to claim China as socialist make, which is that they say they'll dismiss any scholar who isn't like Chinese living in China by saying, oh, well, you know, they're biased for the West and we need only someone who's Chinese living in China. But the thing is, I rarely ever actually see scholars who are Chinese living in China able to like, you know, prop up on like YouTube, for example, or media platforms. And to what extent does that say something about like China's own censorship culture? Because like, if you could only really see scholars who are who are living in China who only say positive things, is there still like a huge culture of censorship? Because from what it seemed to me, that there was actually a big laxing of censorship under Jiang Zemin, particularly with the press. They were able to like ask him questions. It was fascinating to see like clips on YouTube of him being asked questions that were very critical on like live TV. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore in China. Like, you can't really criticize the government in the same way. To what extent is it like, what's the environment like when it comes to being a critical scholar, but also like a journalist?
What's the environment like when it comes to being a critical scholar? Very, there have been times when it's been not too bad. What you cannot do is call for the end of the party and criticize the leadership. But there has been a much more open debate at other times. It has got much worse over the past few years. And in trips out there, I've talked to scholars at various universities. I had a long conversation with a Chinese colleague, who was telling me he wrote a paper about village governance. And by the time he got it back from the censors, they changed it so much. It was about family planning. I mean, just crazy things like that. So censorship has got far, far, far worse. Amongst scholars, has got far, 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 far worse since about 2018. It's been really quite stark and really problematic. So for quite a long time, one of the ways that I mean, it's been a problem in China studies generally, because as international scholars who study China, we want to be able to go there and talk to people. Now, I was a postdoc there at one of the top universities in Beijing from 2013 to 2016. I think there's a bit of that now, but I find it hard. I don't think I would have been able to do that and have the amount of access that I did have now. I think there are still a few people out there, but I went there and I started in 2013, and I sat down the person who was really kind of my line manager, and I said, okay, so I'm in China. I work at your institution. Just be honest with me. Is there anything I really shouldn't do or say? And he said, don't go on any protests because you might get your visa cancelled. But inside our institution, you can say what you like. And we're only asking you to publish papers for international journals, so you can say what you like. I've told this story to people before, actually, and they think I'm lying. That was absolutely true. I just don't think you would get that now. In fact, I wrote a paper in 2018 where I made some comments, really like innocuous. I actually quoted a Chinese newspaper, and it was for a special issue of what I thought was an American journal, but the journal had two different chief editors, and one was based in China and one was based in the United States. And it turned out that this was a special issue, so it's a collection of like themed articles on the same topic, and they had a guest editor for that particular issue, so someone who wasn't full-time attached to the journal. And I was having a conversation with him, and so he's Chinese, and he said, "Oh, there are just a couple of bits. They like your paper, but there are a couple of bits they wanted to take out for political reasons." And I think he didn't realize what he was saying to me, because what he was saying to me was, they want to politically censor your paper. And as an international, an American trained British academic, I'm not going to have my stuff politically censored, even if it's a tiny piece of the paper, which it was, So there was a long back and forth about this. And the special issue editor went to the chief editor at the journal and said, "What is this? Like, why is this happening? Why you want to cut this? I don't see anything wrong with this." She's quoting a Chinese newspaper. And eventually we couldn't get anywhere, and I had to withdraw it. But the Chinese special issue editor, said to me at the time, "I've literally never come across anything like this, and I'm really surprised." So that was 2018. That was a manifestation of the shift that was going on within Chinese academia at the time. So that was really unfortunate. Scholars now are having discussions outside China about how do we continue to conduct our research if A, we can't get into the country, B, we can't get access to the archives, C, no one will talk to us. And there's lots of discussions about how to carry out research through looking at documents that we can access from outside China, or interviewing people in diaspora communities who are outside China, or doing international research and studying companies outside, for example, Chinese investments overseas, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of work now on what people call global China, which is Chinese investments overseas and activities overseas. And one reason for that is you can access it. So lately, there have been positive signs. There's been, I have not yet had a visa turned down. I didn't go to China for a long time, but for 5 years, but I did go last year. I hope to go back again this year. Maybe things will loosen up a bit. I know that Chinese academics were as unhappy about this as we were, because they want to be able to read international journals, and a lot of the major international journals in the China studies field were censored inside China, which is not good for them. And it's, scholars should be collaborating. So,
well,
yeah, it's not.
If you get second thoughts about you've been wanting this part to be out, I can save that for the back room if you're paranoid. But
Did I say anything?
I don't know enough to really know whether that would be.
I didn't name a person, and I didn't name a journal. So I think and it was several years ago. So okay. I think it's okay to talk about this.
Probably fine. Yeah, I'm just somewhat joking. But
no, it's totally serious. I wanted to publish something on this at the time too. I wanted to write something about it, but I was like, I cannot name names here because it would be bad for people. I think this story can probably go out several years later because no one knows what the journal is.
Yeah.
But thank you for saying that, because we do have to be careful.
Yeah, no, this has been very great so far. I think.
Sorry, I screwed up the planning bit.
No, it's fine. I think we're going to have to do another episode at some point, at another point, on two things. Well, one is like Xi Jinping and the way in which the anti-corruption policies, as well as his policies to reduce rural poverty, rural inequality.
Yeah.
Because there's many good things that have happened under Xi Jinping, but simultaneously it seems like I've heard scholars say that power is more concentrated now in China than it ever was, even under Mao, which is fascinating. That could be a topic of another discussion in the future, as well as the kind of the actual structure of their governance, like the decentralization, because you have a video which I recommend my viewers watch, called China's Way More Decentralized Than You Think. And like how they actually...
That needs updating. That does need updating because...
Things always change. China, the leaders don't change, but or the party doesn't change, but the policies change. For us, it's the opposite. Our leaders' policies don't change. In any case, for now, thank you for being here, Jane. It's been wonderful having you. I recommend people check out your channel. Links in the description.
Thank you very much.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.